Okay, so you think you've got the punk rock story down, right? You know, leather, spikes, maybe a bit of a snarl comes to mind. But what if I told you that narrative, well, it really only scratches the surface. We're about to dive into a history that spans continents and generations, uncovering some pretty surprising origins and a relevance that just won't quit.
Okay, yeah, let's unpack this.
Yeah.
Today we're taking a really deep dive into the history and the continuing impact of punk rock.
Yeah.
Our exploration draws from a pretty interesting mix of sources, actually.
Yeah.
We've got a Reddit discussion sparked by a user named James. He was doing research for a class on punk rock, plus some really compelling personal reflections on punk's influence shared on Reddit, Wikimedia's pretty comprehensive entries on punk rock and its subculture.
Right.
And another Reddit thread looking at punk's current pulse, an article exploring its modern-day resurgence, and this great YouTube documentary. It shines a really crucial light on the often untold Latinx history of punk.
Exactly. So our mission for you today is to go beyond those cliches, We want to understand the key moments and the social forces that really shaped punk. We want to trace its evolution through different scenes and eras and ultimately understand why it continues to resonate so powerfully today. Think of this as your shortcut to a richer understanding of a truly influential cultural phenomenon. So with a story this wide-ranging, where do we even begin to unravel it?
Well, it's tempting to jump straight to that late 1970s explosion, right? But the groundwork for punk was actually laid much earlier. You mentioned our Reddit user James, whose curiosity really kicked off this deep dive. He mentioned his long-standing interest after taking a history of rock music course. And to really understand punk, we kind of need to look at its precursors. Mm-hmm. As one Reddit commenter, Vicky Holden, wisely pointed out, we needed to talk about proto-punk.
Right, those bands that had that raw, kind of untamed energy and this rebellious spark that would become so central to punk. But maybe they didn't quite have all the visual markers or the fully formed ideology we associate with it later on.
Exactly. And Wikipedia really fleshes out these stylistic roots. It lists not just proto-punk, obviously, but also things like garage rock, classic rock and roll, rockabilly, glam rock, pub rock, even surf music.
Surf music? That's surprising. It really is a diverse lineage then.
It is, and what's fascinating here is that the term punk rock itself actually predates the late 70s explosion. Lenny Kaye, in his liner notes for the Nuggets compilation album way back in 1972.
Oh, wow, that early.
Yeah. He used punk rock to describe the raw energy of those mid-1960s garage rock bands. Critics were even using the term earlier in the 70s to describe these kind of unpolished, loud, and rebellious groups. So the spirit and even the name were kind of simmering for quite some time before it blew up.
Okay, here's where it gets really interesting for me. That YouTube documentary you mentioned, it really broadens our perspective on these early days by highlighting some often overlooked Latinx proto-punk pioneers. We're talking about Billy Murcia, right? The Colombian-born drummer for the famously outrageous New York Dolls, and Mexican-American bands like Cannibal and the Headhunters.
Yeah, people forget about them.
And maybe the most unexpected for many will be Question Mark and the Mysterians. I mean, their massive hit, 96 Tears, actually topped the Billboard chart in 1966.
Number one. It's incredible.
That's a world away from the safety pinned image that often comes to mind first, Why do you think these early contributions are sometimes missed in the, mainstream punk narrative?
That's a really crucial question. I think often the dominant historical narratives tend to focus on specific geographical locations and demographics. Mm-hmm. And sometimes that means overlooking the contributions of those who are maybe seen as being on the margins. The inclusion of these Latinx artists really challenges a very narrow, often white, Anglo-centric view of who was involved in creating that raw, rebellious sound early on.
Right. It wasn't just one group.
Exactly. Their presence highlights that this initial spark of rebellion wasn't confined to one group or one place at all.
Okay, so the groundwork is laid with these diverse influences, pretty complex roots. Then comes what we usually call the second wave, right? Around 1977 and 1979. The Reddit discussion really emphasizes the different ways this wave kind of manifested on either side of the Atlantic.
Yes, and the contrasting social and economic conditions were really pivotal there. In the UK, punk became this incredibly powerful voice for working class youth who were facing economic hardship and, pretty limited opportunities.
Yeah, you can really hear it.
Totally. Bands like The Clash and the Sex Pistols, with their faster, angrier sound and those really politically charged lyrics, They directly reflected that societal frustration.
Whereas in America, as one Reddit user pointed out, the second wave of punk often seemed to emerge more from a sense of like middle-class alienation, dissatisfaction with suburban culture, that kind of thing. Different kinds of rebellion fueled by very different circumstances.
Absolutely. And by late 1978, the California punk scene really exploded, as our Reddit discussion highlights. And this led to an even more aggressive, more stripped-down sound, and of course, a very distinct visual identity. The iconic mohawks, Liberty spikes, deliberately ripped clothing, those often offensive t-shirts.
And the dirty Converse. Can't forget those.
Forget the dirty Converse.
Yeah.
Bands from Southern California and San Francisco really cemented this look and sound.
So while this more aggressive sound and look was taking hold out in California, the Reddit user mentions that by 1979, punk largely remained an underground thing in cities like New York, Boston, D.C., even still in parts of L.A. But it wasn't just staying in that initial raw form, was it? It started changing again?
Oh, not at all. Well, parts of it were definitely being commercialized and evolving into new wave, which is a whole other fascinating story. Really, punk was also fracturing. It splintered into this really diverse range of subgenres. The Reddit source throws out some names like garage punk, straight edge, hardcore emo, lo-fi.
Okay, so what's significant about this splintering? Why did it break off in so many directions?
Well, it really shows how that initial burst of energy just couldn't be contained. You know, it had to explore different sonic territories and different thematic concerns. Hardcore, for example, took that raw energy and just amplified it. Often with even more direct, more confrontational lyrics, focusing on themes like social injustice and personal struggle.
Right, even more intense.
Exactly. It just demonstrates the creative ferment that punk unleashed. It led to all these different, sometimes even opposing, musical and ideological pathways. Okay, so we've covered the early influences in this really dynamic second wave with its regional variations. But what were the fundamental ideas? You know, the values that underpin this whole movement?
Yeah, this is key. And this is where Wikipedia's entry on punk subculture gives a really solid overview. It emphasizes those core anti-establishment views, a strong belief in individual freedom, and that incredibly important DIY ethic.
The DIY ethic, yeah.
We're talking about fundamental principles like nonconformity, a rejection of capitalism and corporate control, anti-authoritarianism, and a strong emphasis on direct action, and fiercely resisting that idea of selling out.
And these weren't just like abstract philosophical concepts, were they? You see them reflected in the personal experiences people shared in our Reddit sources.
Totally.
One user, whose account was deleted but they identified as 26, shared how punk helped them realize that the world doesn't operate by some fixed set of rules. It empowered them to question authority. That's a pretty profound personal transformation, right?
Absolutely. And another Reddit user, SalviaJoy96, highlights how being part of the punk scene fostered this questioning of all kinds of social structures. It normalized the idea that, hey, maybe a better world was possible. And personally, it led them towards socialist and activist viewpoints. They also mentioned finding a sense of belonging as someone who felt like an outsider, which speaks to another really crucial dimension of punk, that sense of community.
Which brings us perfectly to this core idea of the DIY ethic you mentioned. The Renaissance of Punk Rock article we looked at really underscores this enduring spirit. It's the belief that anyone, like regardless of their technical skills or resources, can pick up an instrument, form a band, and make their voice heard.
Yeah, just do it yourself.
Exactly. This is in direct contrast to the perceived control of the music industry and, mass-produced culture. It's about taking agency.
And Wikipedia touches on this really central and sometimes tricky idea of authenticity within the punk subculture. The term poseur, that's kind of a loaded one, right?
Yeah.
Very loaded.
It's used for those who are seen as just adopting the style, the surface trappings of punk, without genuinely understanding or adhering to its underlying values. Scholar Daniel S. Traber points out that achieving true authenticity in punk was this constantly contested idea. And at some point, it seems like everyone got called a poseur. What was really at the heart of that anxiety around authenticity? Well, I think at its core, the anxiety around being a poseur reflected a fear of co-option, commercialization. There was this strong desire to maintain the genuine rebellious spirit of punk and to resist the mainstream's tendency to just dilute and commodify countercultural movements.
Right.
It was really about ensuring that the music and the message remained true to those initial anti-establishment principles.
That tension, between staying true to the core values and the potential for things becoming inauthentic, That definitely comes up in the Reddit thread, the current and future of punk as well. There's this ongoing debate about like policing the scene and what constitutes true punk versus the fundamental idea of punk as a space for expressing unpopular opinions against the established order. One user, Fishbowl of Teeth, suggests that those who are genuinely committed to the punk ethos will persist, while those who are maybe just chasing a trend will eventually conform. It's a fascinating internal dynamic.
It really is. It shows a passionate investment people have in what punk represents.
Oh.
And it's only natural that these core ideologies often translated into a desire to see real social and political change, right?
Absolutely. Wikipedia notes that punk lyrics frequently engage directly with social and political issues. They give examples like the Clash's, biting commentary on unemployment and career opportunities, and Chelsea's similarly themed Right to Work. And as we've touched on, early British punk was very deliberate in its aim to shock the mainstream. I mean, think about the Sex Pistols' Anarchy in the UK.
Oh, for sure. And we see this personal connection between punk and social awareness in the Reddit reflections, too. Commie Socialist, who got into punk back in 1986, mentioned being deeply influenced by Jello Biafra's outspoken anti-Reagan stance. And that developed into a lasting distrust of government. It was music as a catalyst for political awakening.
And Dispenser412 on Reddit shared a really powerful personal story. Growing up in a conservative rural town, punk music, with its rejection of mainstream norms, basically told his 14-year-old self that the racist attitudes he saw among adults were wrong.
Wow.
Yeah, and that ultimately led him to seek out others who shared his values. That's a really potent example of punk providing validation and like a sense of community for those who felt marginalized or disagreed with their surroundings.
And the YouTube documentary expands our understanding even further here. It highlights bands like Los Aligos, a Chicano punk band in LA. Their music powerfully blended that punk energy with traditional Mexican folk elements and directly addressed the experiences and struggles of immigrant communities. They even had a song specifically about, I think it was Willie Heron's stepfather being deported.
That's specific.
Yeah. And Los Crudos, another really influential Latinx band, they primarily sang in Spanish, focusing on political issues directly relevant to their community. This really underscores how punk became a specific voice for specific experiences of social injustice, not just a general anti-establishment feeling.
So the message was definitely a core part of punk. And the look, the fashion, it either developed alongside it or became another way of expressing those ideas, right? What can we say about punk fashion and its relationship to gender?
Well, Wikipedia's entry on punk rock highlights how early female punk musicians actively challenged those traditional, often really limiting roles for women in rock music. You think of someone like Susie Sue, with her striking and hugely influential style, or Patti Smith's deliberately androgynous presentation.
Yeah, iconic looks.
Totally. These were powerful visual statements that pushed back against established norms. And over time, elements like tattoos, piercings, deliberately provocative or torn clothing, along with those famous spiked accessories, became more widely adopted as visual signifiers of that rebellious spirit. The mohawk, of course, became almost instantly recognizable as a punk statement.
But then Wikipedia on the punk subculture also points out that within some parts of the scene, particularly maybe the post-1980s US hardcore movement, there was almost an anti-fashion stance. With many opting for very plain attire like simple t-shirts and jeans, it seems the focus shifted even more towards the message and the music for some people.
Exactly. Rock historian Helen Reddington argues that actually many women involved in punk were more interested in the underlying ideology and making a statement through their music and actions, rather than solely focusing on fashion. And Caroline Kuhn even suggests that women had a much more prominent and active role in punk compared to earlier rock music scenes. They were more visible.
Okay, that makes sense. And the YouTube documentary brings in Alice Bag of the Bags. As Violence Girl, she was a really foundational figure in hardcore, right? And she talks about how her Chicanidad came through in my body, what I look like, my language, highlighting how personal identity intersected directly with her punk expression.
Yeah, it wasn't separate.
And we also get a mention of Riot Girl, of course, as this hugely important feminist hardcore punk movement that emerged in the early 1990s, further challenging gender norms and really amplifying female voices within the punk landscape.
Absolutely. It's clear that punk created a space for challenging not just broad societal norms, but also very specific constraints around gender and identity. Now, one of the most compelling aspects revealed by our sources, I think, is how punk spread and was uniquely adopted beyond the confines of the Western world.
Yes, the YouTube documentary is absolutely crucial here. It really dismantles that limited image of punks as solely, angsty white boys. It vividly details the rich and largely unacknowledged Latinx history of punk in Los Angeles. Fueled by feelings of displacement, a sense of being outsiders, it also highlights the vital role of key venues like the Mask and the Starwood. And later, the vibrant East LA scene centered around Club Vex, which was famously hosted by Sister Karen, a literal punk rock nun.
A punk rock nun. You can't make this stuff up. It's such a powerful image.
It really sticks with you.
It really underscores the idea that the spirit of rebellion and the desire for self-expression inherent in punk resonated deeply with marginalized communities all across the globe. And in Peru, as the documentary explains, something as simple as the accessibility of cassette tapes played a crucial role in democratizing music. It allowed punk to spread rapidly among young people caught in the turmoil of political violence there. Bands like Narcosis recorded their music on incredibly basic equipment, making it a truly grassroots form of cultural resistance.
Wow, just using what they had. And the Wikipedia entry on punk subculture touches on the scene in Mexico too, right? Where punk initially had more of an upper-middle-class following, apparently, but quickly found a home among working-class youth, many of whom were university students.
Yeah, it shifted.
They developed their own distinct subcultural markers, like Chavas Banda youth gangs, sort of unique oral nicknames, and a strong preference for lyrics in Spanish that reflected their own experiences.
And we even get a glimpse into the punk scene in Cuba with Los Frikis.
Yeah.
These were young people who would go to great lengths, like listening to crackly Florida radio broadcasts, just to hear rock music.
Just to hear it.
Yeah.
Right.
Some even found a gathering place at El Patio de Maria, the community center that provided this rare platform for rock bands to play. It just demonstrates the resilience of this subculture, even when facing significant restrictions.
It's truly remarkable to see how this seemingly specific genre just took root and evolved in such diverse cultural contexts, taking on local flavors and addressing local realities everywhere it went. Which brings us, I guess, to the present day. Is punk still a relevant force? The Renaissance of Punk Rock article certainly makes a strong case that it is. It argues that its core beliefs are finding renewed resonance in contemporary society.
Absolutely. The article rightly points out punk's undeniable and lasting influence on subsequent genres like grunge, hardcore, alternative rock. The list goes on. But it also highlights how contemporary punk is still evolving. It's incorporating elements of electronic music, hip-hop, experimental noise. You look at bands like Death Grips or Sleaford Mods pushing those sonic boundaries.
Right, and it's not just about the music anymore either, is it? The article emphasizes how that rebellious DIY spirit continues to fuel grassroots movements, focused on issues like climate activism, anti-capitalism. That core impulse to challenge the status quo is finding new outlets.
Definitely. And the underground punk scene remains incredibly vital. It's thriving in DIY venues and through independent labels, just like the article underscores. And even on a more mainstream level, punk's aesthetics, even if sometimes in a kind of watered-down form, have undeniably permeated fashion and film. It shows its lasting cultural impact.
So yeah, punk rock, far from being just some faded trend of the past, it really reveals itself as this incredibly dynamic and globally significant force, from its diverse and often surprising proto-punk origins, including those vital Latinx contributions we talked about, through its continuous evolution and adaptation right into the 21st century. It has consistently provided a voice for the marginalized, challenged societal norms at their core, and championed that empowering DIY ethic. The personal stories and the broader historical context we've explored today really underscore punk's enduring power to shape individual identities and drive social change across vastly different cultures.
Which kind of leaves us with a thought for you, the listener. Considering punk's incredible journey, from the absolute fringes to a point of mainstream awareness and its ongoing role in various forms of activism, what do you think is the most potent act of rebellion possible in our hyper-connected, rapidly evolving world today? Is it about amplifying dissenting voices within the existing systems? Or does real rebellion now lie in creating entirely new, independent, countercultural spaces and forms of expression that operate completely outside those systems altogether? Something to mull over.